A GPS tracker unearths a secret affair, but trust me, the real twist will leave you stunned. Buckle up for an emotional journey you'll be thinking about long after. Some men, honestly, are completely oblivious. I used to be one of them, proud member of the Clueless Club. We should have weekly meetings, maybe gather in a dingy bar with pitchers of beer and a side of regret, commiserating over our collective ignorance. The kicker? We wouldn't even realize those meetings were about us. I married Amanda when we were fresh-faced and full of optimism, barely into our 20s. Fast forward to now, I'm 43, she's 41, and over the years, we built a life together. 3 kids, countless milestones, and even a few genuinely fun moments scattered between the chaos of parenting. I wasn't just a husband, I aimed to be a good one. The kind of man books and sermons tell you to be: loyal, reliable, and steadfast. I stuck to that script as if my life depended on it. But when our eldest, Emily, packed her bags and headed off to college, a little voice in my head wondered, what's Amanda going to do now that the nest is starting to empty? Soon enough, she found something to keep herself occupied, volunteering at Riverwood Memorial Hospital. 3 days a week, she helped out in the gift shop or entertained kids in the playroom. Occasionally, she mentioned picking up an extra shift, but I didn't press for details. We still had our circle of friends, folks we'd met during soccer games and school fundraisers. Every few weeks, we'd gather for a barbecue or potluck at someone's house, swapping stories and pretending we were still young. I was particularly tight with 3 guys, Mike, Dave, and Steve. Fishing buddies. We'd hit the lakes a handful of times a year, enjoying the quiet of the water and a break from everyday life. To me, our marriage felt ordinary. Kids leaving, wives finding hobbies, husbands counting down to retirement, while clinging to weekend escapes. On those fishing trips, we'd talk about it all: jobs, families, and sometimes, even relationships. One weekend in May, the 4 of us were out on the lake, rods in hand, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the breeze and gentle ripples. Mike started rambling about his son's college adventures at Michigan State, but I noticed Steve wasn't his usual chatty self. He looked preoccupied. "Steve, you've been quiet," I said, glancing his way. "What's going on? Something eating at you?" He hesitated, his eyes darting around like he was debating whether to open his mouth. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know if I should say this. If I'm wrong, it could stir up trouble. But if I'm right..." His voice trailed off. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "You saw something, didn't you?" Steve gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I saw something. Amanda's car. Twice. Parked behind the Sunrise Inn." My heart skipped a beat. "When?" "First time was 3 weeks ago. Second time, just a few days back." Dave cut in, his tone sharp. "Hold on, are you saying Amanda's cheating?" "I'm not saying anything," Steve shot back. "But twice, at the same hotel? It's suspicious." Mike frowned. "What were you doing at the Sunrise Inn, Steve?" "Work," Steve snapped. "I deliver supplies to a bunch of places, including that hotel. This isn't about me." I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, my mind spinning in 100 directions. Could Amanda really be cheating? I couldn't wrap my head around it. But what if? Back home, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, after Amanda went to bed, I stayed up researching surveillance gadgets. By morning, I'd ordered a GPS tracker and an audio recorder, both discreet enough to stay under her radar. The tracker arrived first. I installed it under her car late one evening, my hands trembling as I worked. The next day, the recorder showed up, and I tucked it into the car, ensuring I could eavesdrop on her drives. Soon enough, I got my first real lead. Over breakfast, Amanda mentioned she'd spend the day running errands. I tracked her movements from my office, first to the mall, then the grocery store. All routine. But later she left again. This time, her route took a strange turn. 10 minutes south, then east, then the Sunrise Inn. My heart felt like it stopped. I grabbed my keys, racing to the hotel. Parking out of sight, I spotted her car right where Steve said it had been. I sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at her car and trying to piece together a reality I wasn't ready to face. At 4:20 p.m., Amanda stepped out of the hotel, her head held high as she strolled straight to her car. My breath caught when I noticed someone else emerge just seconds later, Brad Turner, a guy from our neighborhood. As she drove off, Brad gave her a slight nod, like they were sharing some kind of silent understanding. My stomach churned. Brad? Of all people? He was married to Liz, one of the warmest, most stunning women in our social circle. Completely unfazed, Brad climbed into his car and drove away, blissfully unaware that I'd just witnessed the whole thing. I sat frozen in my car, my mind spinning. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my daze. Amanda's voice came through, calm and cheerful. Hey, Mark! What do you feel like having for dinner? Dinner? I echoed, struggling to find my footing in the conversation. Maybe something light. How about salmon? A salad? Sounds good. I'll be home a little after 5, she replied, hanging up like everything was perfectly normal. But nothing felt normal. I stayed in that parking lot for a few more minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Then, acting on pure instinct, I headed inside the hotel. The receptionist at the front desk turned out to be someone I recognized, Katie, the daughter of one of my clients. We exchanged polite hellos before I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low. Katie, I was wondering if you could help me. A friend mentioned that another friend might be staying here, and I wanted to check. Can you look up a name for me? Sure, she said with a smile, fingers poised over the keyboard. What's the name? Brad Turner. She typed quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. Room 312. He's here every Thursday, checks in during the morning and leaves the next day. Every Thursday? I asked, my pulse quickening. Yeah, sometimes more often, but Thursdays are consistent, she replied. Can you tell how long he's been doing this? Katie hesitated, then tapped a few more keys. Since February, she said finally. My mouth went dry. Would it cause any trouble if you printed his stay history for me? She glanced around the lobby, then back at me. No one will know, she whispered. Do you want a printout? I nodded. Please. She handed me a slim folder, which I slid into my briefcase without looking at it. Thanks, Katie, I murmured, heading back to my car. By the time I got home, Amanda had already whipped up salmon and a salad, just like she'd promised. We ate dinner together, her voice light and casual as she recounted her day. She mentioned shopping at Willow Grove Mall and stopping by Town Market, both places I'd already tracked earlier, but conveniently skipped over any mention of the Sunrise Inn. She lied. Right to my face. After dinner, I excused myself and went to the bathroom. The shower tiles were still damp, and there were fresh clothes in the laundry basket. My mind spiraled, rage bubbling beneath the surface. What was she washing away? The scent of the hotel? The smell of him? I returned to the living room, forcing myself to stay calm as she curled up on the couch with a book. Meanwhile, I sat at my computer and opened our family contacts. Scrolling down, I found Liz Turner's email addresses, one for home and another for her real estate job. I created a throwaway email account and typed out a brief, direct message to her work address. If you want to know who, when, and where Brad is cheating on you, reply to this email. I have evidence. I don't want anything from you. I hit send at 8:15 p.m., then waited. By 9 o'clock, her reply appeared in my inbox. I can meet tomorrow anytime. I'll be at 410 Oak Avenue in Fairfield all day showing houses. We can talk at lunch around 1 o'clock. I deleted both emails from her account and mine, then closed my laptop. Amanda was already asleep when I climbed into bed. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my mind replaying everything over and over. The next morning, Amanda was her usual cheerful self as she got ready for her volunteer shift at the hospital. I kissed her goodbye, keeping my smile in place like it was business as usual. At noon, I gave her a quick call. Hey, I was thinking of taking care of dinner tonight, I said, injecting a casual tone into my voice. Are you going to cook? She asked, surprised. Yeah, I was thinking jambalaya. Sound good? Perfect, she replied, her happiness practically radiating through the phone. I hung up, checked the GPS tracker, and confirmed her location at the hospital before heading out. On the way to meet Liz, I made a pit stop at Brad's office. As I pulled up, I spotted him and a couple of coworkers heading toward a nearby deli. Taking advantage of the moment, I slipped out of my car and quickly installed a second GPS tracker on his vehicle. By 1 o'clock, I arrived at 410 Oak Avenue and parked a couple of houses down. Walking up to the open house, I spotted Liz inside. Her face went pale as soon as she saw me. Without a word, she locked the door, flipped the sign to lunch break, and led me to the couch. Her eyes were glassy, brimming with unshed tears as she sat down and looked at me. I opened my briefcase, pulled out the folder, and handed her the hotel records. As she skimmed through the papers, her shoulders began to shake. The tears came fast and hard. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Through her sobs, she managed to choke out, "That bastard's been cheating on me for months, with your wife." I nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so." She wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "These records help, but they're not enough. We need something solid, undeniable. And once we have it, we'll figure out what to do next." I nodded again. "We'll get what we need. Together. We can't just blow up and react emotionally," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions in her eyes. "I agree," I replied, even though my frustration was simmering just beneath the surface. "I've been trying to stay calm, but it's not exactly easy. We've got to play this smart." For the next hour, we sat in her open house, hashing out a plan. By the time we were done, the clock had ticked past 4, and not a single prospective buyer had shown up. At least we had a strategy now, and that was worth more than any sale. Later that evening, I sat at my computer, scrolling through potential conferences that could double as a cover story. It didn't take long to find one in Las Vegas that fit my profession, and conveniently, another for realtors happening around the same time. I shot the details over to Rachel, and within minutes she replied, "We should go." I booked my reservation that night, and casually brought it up to Amanda during dinner. "There's a conference in Vegas I'm thinking about attending. It could be good for networking. Want to come with me?" Amanda tilted her head thoughtfully. "I'll think about it. But honestly, a 3-day trip to Vegas sounds exhausting right now." The next day, Rachel played her part, telling Brad about the realtor conference and inviting him to join her. He brushed it off, claiming work was too hectic. Meanwhile, Amanda called me at work, saying she wasn't up for a long drive and a Vegas trip either. Instead, she mentioned visiting her sister for a couple of days. I pretended to be disappointed. "Well, if you change your mind, let me know," I said lightly. That same day, I reached out to Henry Patterson, my lawyer. Henry had handled all my business legalities over the years, but this time, I needed advice on something much more personal. "Henry, do you have any professional or personal connections to Amanda?" I asked. "No, none," he confirmed. With that assurance, I laid out the situation. We discussed the potential fallout of a divorce, and I took detailed notes, as he explained asset division and ways to protect myself. By the end of our call, Henry had not only devised a financial plan but also hired a private investigator to secure hard evidence of Amanda's affair. At 4 p.m., Rachel called from a payphone. "I've booked a room at the Mirage," she said. "Good," I replied. "I'm staying at Treasure Island. Let's talk about how we'll handle communication while we're there." We agreed to keep things discreet. She'd bring her laptop, a notebook, and a basic burner phone that wouldn't raise suspicion. That night, as I packed my suitcase, Amanda wandered into the bedroom. Her eyes landed on the suitcase, and she quipped, "You forgot your swimsuit." "I'm not going on vacation," I said, shaking my head. "Still, swimming helps you relax," she replied with a small smile. I tossed the swimsuit into the bag, more to keep the peace than anything else. She didn't say anything more, and I finished packing in silence. Later, As we went through our evening routine, I made one last attempt to bridge the gap between us. Want to join me tonight? I asked. She chuckled softly. Maybe when you get back, she teased, flashing a coy smile before heading off to bed. Before dawn, I was on the road, leaving Hartford behind. Around 7:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Rachel. Where are you? She asked. Just passing through Pomona, I said. There's a Denny's up ahead, remember the one we used to stop at on our way to the fair with the kids? Perfect. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. When she arrived, Rachel looked nothing like the polished realtor I'd always known. She wore jeans, a casual button-up, and boots, her hair loosely pulled back. Her smile, though faint, was genuine. Over breakfast, we talked through our next steps, venting our shared anger and sadness. There was something unexpectedly refreshing about seeing her as a regular person, not just Brad's wife. Afterward, Rachel mentioned how much she dreaded the long solo drive to Vegas. An idea struck me. Why don't you follow me? Actually, hold on. We found a nearby parking lot and asked the attendant how much it would cost to leave her car for 3 days. It was reasonable, so she parked, and we transferred her luggage into my car. The drive to Vegas felt lighter with her beside me. We planned out our strategy, talked for hours, and even found moments to laugh at the absurdity of our situation. By the time we stopped for gas in Baker, the tension had eased, and we both felt a little more prepared for what lay ahead. Once in Vegas, I dropped Rachel off at the Mirage and checked into my room at Treasure Island. We agreed to meet for dinner later that evening. As I settled into my room, my phone buzzed again. It was Henry. You can come back now, he said with a chuckle. Your wife's at Brad's house. We've got everything on video. I felt my chest tighten. Are you sure? Positive. There's even a magazine on the table with today's date. It's rock-solid evidence. What do you want me to do? Start the procedure, I said, my voice firm. Rachel's already called me, he added. With your evidence, this will make things easier for both of you. Henry, I said after a pause, can I ask you something hypothetical? Of course. What would happen if Rachel and I don't know, started dating while we're in Vegas? He laughed. Unless either of you is being followed, nothing. Just spread your time between the 2 rooms. Do you want her or Brad to be served with the papers before you're back? Henry asked, his tone calm but direct. No, I said firmly. I want to be home, changing the locks, before Amanda gets the papers. And see if you can arrange a restraining order to keep her away from my business and the house. When do you want everything ready? He asked. I'll talk it over with Rachel and let you know, I replied before ending the call. About an hour later, I walked into Caesar's Palace and found the restaurant where Rachel and I had planned to meet for dinner. We started with small talk, keeping things light. After we ordered, I stepped away for a moment to call Henry. Wait to take action until we're back, I told him. Let your investigator gather more evidence while we're here. It's better to have overwhelming proof than just enough. Once I hung up, Rachel and I finished our meal and wandered through the shops at Caesar's Palace. There was an unspoken tension between us, an undeniable pull that neither of us acknowledged aloud. But the image of Amanda with Brad kept creeping into my mind, and I could tell Rachel was wrestling with the same thoughts about her husband. When Rachel finally said she was tired, I hailed a cab for her. As she stood by the door, I noticed the way her eyes lingered on mine, as though she wanted to kiss me. I felt the same, but we both held back. It wasn't time for that, not yet. Back in my hotel room, I took a long shower, letting the water wash away the weight of the day. Just as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. It was Amanda. Hey, she said. Where have you been? I had dinner at Caesar's Palace and walked around afterward, I replied, keeping my tone casual. I saw some outfits I thought you might like. Something sexy. Should I pick one up for you? Sexy clothes? She scoffed. You know I hardly wear things like that anymore. I'm almost 50, Mark. So that's a no? I asked, already knowing the answer. Yeah, no sexy clothes, she said. But if you find a nice piece of jewelry, maybe grab that instead. Sure, I replied. I'll take a look tomorrow. For now, I'm turning off my phone and getting some rest. Good night, Amanda. I love you. Good night, she said, but the words I love you didn't follow. I stared at the phone for a long moment, the sting of her silence sharper than I'd expected. Just as I was about to shut it off, it rang again. This time, it was Rachel. Open the door, she said simply. When I did, she stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. I was still wrapped in a towel, and she was wearing the same jeans and boots from earlier. Brad doesn't care that I'm gone, she said quietly. He's with your wife right now, in our bed. Her voice broke slightly, but she held herself together. I thought about this the whole way back to my hotel. She smiled sadly before continuing. At first, I thought I wanted to be with you just because they cheated on us. But it's more than that. I don't want to spend the next year crying over him or feeling sorry for myself. I want to move forward. I want you. But not like this, not for revenge. I need to feel loved, not used. Just hold me. Please. That night, we lay together, but not in the way I'd imagined. We didn't cross any lines. Instead, we found comfort in each other's presence, sharing the kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with sex. By the time we got up the next day, it was nearly noon. After we showered and dressed, I drove Rachel back to the Mirage so she could change clothes. While she was in her room, I called Henry. The investigator has everything, Henry told me. They spent the night together at her house. There's even video of them in bed with today's newspaper on the nightstand. That's more than enough, I said. Thank you. Rachel and I decided to spend the afternoon at Lake Mead. On the drive there, we unloaded all the anger, sadness, and betrayal we'd been carrying. By the time we reached Kingman, Arizona, the anger had dulled, leaving only a bittersweet sadness. Over dinner, we admitted something that had been simmering under the surface for a while. We'd stopped loving our spouses long before any of this happened. We loved our kids, yes, but the connection with our partners had faded years ago. After dinner, we drove back to Las Vegas. I checked out of my hotel at Treasure Island and moved into Rachel's room at the Mirage. That night, we made love. It wasn't just about physical intimacy. It was about finding solace in each other after everything we'd endured. Rachel cried quietly, and though I almost did, I managed to hold it back. When it was time to return home, we stopped at the parking lot where Rachel had left her car. As we transferred her luggage, she turned to me. What now? I didn't hesitate. I want to wake up with you every morning. We can't go back to how things were. They made their choices, and now we're making ours. She nodded slowly. Let's switch houses. I don't want to sleep in the same bed as Brad anymore. I want to be with you. I smiled. Then let's make this real. Let's live our lives without anger or betrayal. We get to choose how this ends. We swapped seats, and I followed her back to my office. Before I got out of the car, she turned to me. Are we really doing this? You want all four of us to get divorced? You want to live together? Yes, I said firmly. I want us to move forward. The day our divorces are finalized, I want to marry you. Will you marry me? She smiled softly, her eyes brimming with emotion. It's too soon. We barely know each other, not like this, Rachel said, her voice tinged with hesitation. Rachel, I replied gently. We've known each other for years. What we didn't know is that we could be more than just friends. I love you. I can commit to loving you right now. She looked at me, her expression softening, and after a long pause, she whispered, I love you too, Mark. I'll think about everything while I drive. See you soon. When I pulled into the office parking lot, Rachel was already there, waiting. She opened my car door, slid in beside me, and smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face. Yes, she said. I love you. Yes, I want to wake up with you every morning. And yes, I'll marry you. What do we do next? She asked, still sitting close to me in the car. I checked the GPS trackers on Amanda's and Brad's cars. Both were parked at Rachel's house. We need to talk to them, I said simply. We drove to her house, staying just far enough behind Amanda's car to avoid suspicion. Parking a block away, we entered through the back door, our steps careful and deliberate. Inside, we made our way to the living room, where we found Amanda and Brad sitting close together on the couch, engrossed in conversation. I motioned for Rachel to sit on the sofa across from them, and we both sat down silently, our eyes fixed on the pair. Amanda froze mid-sentence when she noticed us, her face draining of color. "Oh my God!" she whispered. Brad, startled, shot up from the couch. "Mark, Rachel, this isn't what it looks like." "Sit down," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "We'll talk in a moment." Amanda stood abruptly, her voice trembling. "Mark, please, let me explain." "You'll get your chance," I said, cutting her off. "For now, go upstairs and get dressed." Without another word, they hurried up the stairs. Rachel and I gathered their clothes from the room, took them to the bathroom, and placed everything inside. When I heard the shower running, I quietly opened the door, tossed the clothes inside, and walked back to the living room. Rachel was kneeling on the carpet, meticulously scrubbing at a stain. "Choose," I said softly. She looked up at me, confused. "Choose what? Where do you want to live, my house or yours?" Her brow furrowed. "Why do I get to choose?" "Because they're the ones who destroyed everything. We get to decide what happens next." Before she could respond, Amanda and Brad returned, fully dressed, their faces a mixture of shame and apprehension. I motioned for them to sit on the sofa opposite us, and Rachel took her place beside me. Brad opened his mouth to speak, but Rachel raised a hand, silencing him. "Brad," I said, my voice steady, "do you love Amanda, or was this just about sex?" He stared at the floor for what felt like an eternity before finally muttering, "I think I love her." I turned to Amanda. "Do you love Brad?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. I nodded. "If you weren't married to us, would you want to be together?" Brad hesitated, glancing at Amanda. I don't want a divorce," he said quietly. "So what do you want? My permission to keep sleeping with my wife?" I asked, my tone calm, though fury simmered beneath the surface. Brad's face crumpled with regret. "I didn't want you to find out. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Amanda was crying now, her hands trembling. "Mark, I never meant for this to happen. I'm so sorry. You hurt me," I said, my voice even. "You planned this. You went to that hotel over 20 times to meet someone else's spouse. You destroyed our marriage." I turned to Brad. "You have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave. The rest you can work out with my lawyer." Rachel glanced at her watch, her expression unreadable. "4 minutes," she said quietly. Brad finally stood, defeated, and walked to the bedroom. I followed, watching as he packed his suitcase in silence. "You don't want to be here when the timer runs out," I warned him, my voice low. He nodded, zipped up his bag, and left the house without saying a word to either of us. Turning to Amanda, I said, "Go. Pack your things and leave my house." She stood shakily, tears streaming down her face. "You can work with my lawyer to negotiate what you're entitled to," I added, "but don't step foot in my house again without his consent. And if either of you comes near my property without permission, I'll make sure everyone, including our kids, knows what you've done." Rachel and I watched as Amanda walked to her car, loading her belongings with trembling hands. Brad pulled up behind her in his own car. They lingered in the driveway, talking quietly. I turned on the audio monitor I'd installed in Amanda's car, listening to their conversation. "They're not going to let this go," Brad said, his voice heavy. "No," Amanda replied. "They're divorcing us. Mark is done with me. He called me heartless, and maybe he's right." "You're not heartless," Brad said softly. "But what are we going to do?" Amanda's voice broke as she snapped. "You're still thinking like this isn't your problem. We got caught cheating, Brad. And now you're acting like you don't want to deal with the consequences. You did this to me. Amanda sobbed, her voice raw with anger and grief. Now I've lost everything. My family, my home, everything. And you don't even care. You're just leaving me to deal with this mess while you walk away like it's nothing. Her words cut through the stillness in the car. Moments later, I heard the faint sound of the door opening and closing. Brad had climbed into Amanda's car. Their conversation became muffled as they drove off, and I reached over to turn off the audio. I sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Despite my anger and the betrayal, a part of me hated seeing Amanda like this, broken, hurting. But she had made her choices, and there was no undoing the damage now. After a while, I headed to the garage. Years ago, I'd bought a set of locks that I'd never gotten around to installing. Today felt like the right time to put them to use. For the next hour, I replaced every lock in the house, ensuring Amanda's keys would no longer work. When I finished, I called Rachel. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "It was harder than I thought," she admitted, her voice soft. "Brad left, but not before making things ugly. I'm coming over now." "Good. I'll see you soon," I said, feeling an odd sense of relief knowing she was on her way. 15 minutes later, Rachel pulled into my driveway. We sat together in the kitchen, talking about everything that had happened. She told me about her confrontation with Brad, and I shared the details of Amanda's tearful departure. We discussed what came next, divorce proceedings, selling Rachel's house, and how we'd blend our families. The road ahead was long, but at least we knew where we were headed now. Rachel gave me a sad smile as she sipped her coffee. "We're really doing this, aren't we? Starting over." I nodded. "Yes, we are. We've made our decision. Now we just have to follow through." She hesitated, then said, "It's funny. A few days ago, I was still holding out hope that maybe David and I could fix things. But I see now, it was never going to work. He didn't want to fix it, and neither did Amanda." "I feel the same," I said. "I was holding on to something that wasn't real anymore. We both were. Now we can move on." We hugged for a long time, finding comfort in the shared understanding that our old lives were over. In their place, we were building something new. The next morning, Rachel and I began packing some of her things. We decided she'd move into my house for now until we figured out a long-term plan. While boxing up items, Rachel's phone rang. It was Carol, her daughter. "Mom, where are you? I called Dad this morning, and he said I should ask you what's going on." Rachel's face tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "Honey, can you come home? Bring your brother. We need to talk." Carol pressed for answers, but Rachel stayed firm. "We'll talk when you get here," she insisted before hanging up. She turned to me, her hands trembling slightly. "It's time to tell the kids, isn't it?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's time." I called my kids, Emily, Kyle, and Matt, and asked them to come home as soon as possible. They could hear the tension in my voice, but like Rachel, I told them we'd talk when they arrived. We also called Henry, our lawyer, to let him know we were holding a family meeting. He promised to bring the photographs and be on standby if we needed him. Once the calls were made, we continued packing, stacking boxes in the garage and waiting for our children. By early afternoon, they had all arrived at my house. Rachel and I sat on one side of the living room, our kids on the other. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and concern. I took a deep breath and started. "I'm sure you've noticed things haven't been right between me and your mom," I began, addressing my kids first. "A few weeks ago, I found out that your mom has been having an affair. I have evidence, and it's undeniable." The room fell silent. Kyle shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "You're saying Mom's been cheating? Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "I saw them together, and I have hotel records to prove it." I glanced at Rachel, who took a deep breath and began speaking to her own kids. "Your dad, Brad, has been seeing Nick's wife, Amanda," she said. "It's true. I have all the proof if you want to see it. But we're not here to dwell on the details. We've decided to get divorced. We're done living in the shadow of betrayal. Carol's face crumpled, her eyes wide with shock. She had always admired her father, and hearing the truth felt like a heavy blow. Rachel reached over and placed a hand on her daughter's arm. I know this is a lot to take in, honey, but we'll get through it together. We're moving forward, and so will you. The room was filled with an aching silence as everyone processed the news. But for Rachel and me, it was also the first step toward a new beginning. What happens now? Carol asked, her voice shaky as she looked between her mom and me. We're selling the house, Rachel said, her tone calm but resolute. Nick and I, well, we've been talking about a future together. Matt, my youngest, blurted out. Wait, so you two are together now? Rachel and I exchanged a glance. We've only just started, I said carefully. But yes, we're moving in that direction. The room fell silent again, the weight of the situation settling over everyone. Finally, Carol stood and walked over to the table where I'd placed the envelope of evidence. She opened it with trembling hands, pulling out a single photograph of her father with Amanda. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Dad's such a bastard, she whispered, closing the envelope and handing it back to me. I can't believe he did this. I placed a hand on her shoulder, sharing her pain. I know, I said softly. Kyle and Matt sat in silence, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. Samantha, my eldest, looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. What now, Dad? She asked, her voice unsteady. Now we move forward, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. We pick up the pieces and create something new. Rachel and I will figure things out, but for now, we're here for you. Whatever you need. The room grew heavy with emotion. Samantha wiped away a tear, while Kyle stared at the floor, still struggling to process everything. Finally, Matt broke the silence. Are you really selling the house, Mom? He asked Rachel quietly. She nodded, offering him a small, sad smile. Yes, honey. I don't need this big house anymore. It holds too many memories, and I think it's time for a fresh start. Carol stood straighter, her expression firm despite her tear-streaked face. We'll get through this. We've been through tough things before, and we'll get through this too. She glanced at me, then back at her mom. I'm not going to lie, it's going to take time for me to process all of this. But if you're happy with Nick, and you're serious, then I'll support you. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she pulled Carol into a hug. Thank you, sweetie. It means so much to me that you're willing to be open to this. Kyle finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I don't even know what to say. I'm angry at Mom. I'm angry at Brad. But if this is what's happening, I guess I'll deal with it. He looked at me, his frustration and sadness evident. I just need some time. I understand, Kyle, I said, nodding. Take all the time you need. None of this is easy, it's been hard on all of us. Rachel broke the silence with a suggestion. Why don't we all have some dinner? It's been a long day, and I think we could all use a break. We ordered takeout from Dragon Palace, a nearby Chinese restaurant the kids had always loved. The mood at dinner was somber but a little lighter. The kids started asking questions, how the divorces would work, what life would look like, and how we planned to handle everything. Rachel and I answered as honestly as we could, explaining that we were taking things one step at a time. We reassured them that while things would be different, we would all figure it out together. By the end of the meal, Carol looked at me again. I still don't want to believe Dad could do something like this, she said. But I can't argue with the proof. I just hope you and Mom can be happier now. I gave her a soft smile. We will be. And we'll all get through this, together. The evening ended on a surprisingly hopeful note. Though the kids weren't happy about what had happened, they seemed willing to give us a chance to move forward. Later that night, after the kids left, Rachel and I sat alone in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, letting out a long sigh. That went better than I thought it would, she admitted. Yeah, I agreed. It's a lot for them to take in, but I think they'll be okay. Rachel nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I was worried about how they'd react, but I feel a bit more hopeful now. Maybe we really can move forward and start fresh. I stepped closer to her, placing my hands gently on her shoulders. We can. We will. This is our chance to build something new, something better. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. Rachel and I spent hours discussing how we were going to move forward. We worked on divorce paperwork, met with Henry, and started making plans for Rachel to sell her house and move in with me. One evening, after a particularly draining day of meetings and phone calls, we sat together in the living room, sorting through logistics. It was exhausting, but having a clear path ahead felt oddly comforting. A few days later, Rachel's kids came by to help pack up more of her belongings. It was bittersweet, memories tied to every corner of the house, but we all worked together, laughing occasionally at old family stories as we boxed things up. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it also felt hopeful. Her children had grown up in that house, and every item we packed seemed to carry a story. I could see it was hard for Rachel. Each memory tucked into a box was a reminder of the life she was leaving behind, but she stayed focused, determined to move forward. By the end of the day, the house felt less like the home it had been and more like a place ready for sale. That weekend, we decided to take a family camping trip. It was something both our families had done together before everything fell apart. The kids thought it could be a way to start fresh as one family. I could see the nervous energy in their faces as we loaded up the cars, but beneath it was something else, a spark of hope. When we arrived at the campground, the tension started to ease. We set up the tents, built a fire, and soon the kids were laughing, sharing stories, and letting go of some of the weight they'd been carrying. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of calm. As the firelight flickered and the sky darkened, Carol broke the silence. "This feels good," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. "I didn't think I'd feel normal again after everything that happened, but this, being here with all of us, it helps." The other kids nodded, their expressions lighter than they had been in weeks. Samantha smiled at me and said, "It's strange, but I'm glad we're here together. It feels like maybe things will be okay after all." I glanced at Rachel, her face glowing in the firelight, and felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. After everything we'd been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, we were finding our way forward. Together. The next morning, we hiked through the woods. The kids led the way, their laughter echoing through the trees, as if the burden of the past few months had finally lifted. Rachel and I walked a few paces behind, soaking in the crisp air and the sight of our children bonding. "You know," she said, looking over at me, "this trip was exactly what we needed." "I think so too," I replied, smiling. By the time we returned to the campsite that afternoon, we were exhausted but happy. That night, as we sat around the fire once more, I realized just how much we had grown as a family. The scars of betrayal hadn't vanished, but we were healing, together. Months turned into years. The divorces were finalized, and Rachel sold her house. We officially moved in together and began building a new life. The kids adjusted to our relationship, though it wasn't always easy. They respected the fact that we had chosen to move forward, even if it meant leaving pieces of the past behind. Holidays came and went, and our blended family found a rhythm. We created new traditions, built new memories, and slowly the pain of the past began to fade. One day, out of the blue, we got news that Brad had been sentenced to several years in prison. His attack on me, compounded by other charges, had finally caught up to him. None of the kids wanted to visit him, and the news didn't seem to shock them. It was just another chapter closed. As for Amanda, she seemed to vanish after withdrawing money from a joint account and leaving town. No one heard from her again. Her absence weighed on the kids for a while, but in time they accepted it. She had made her choice, and they had made theirs. For years past. Every year, we kept our camping tradition alive. It became a way for us to reconnect and reflect on how far we'd come. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer defined us. Some people, I realized, are helpless. They let their mistakes and betrayals destroy everything they've built. But not us. We chose to rebuild, to find strength in each other, and create something better out of the ashes. As I sat by the campfire, surrounded by Rachel and the kids, I felt a deep sense of peace. We had come so far, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together. We were a family, imperfect but whole. And that was enough.